Hey everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video is a what we eat in a week. Now, I'm recording the intro at my mum's place because I'm here for our 6-weekly grocery haul. So instead of being in the garden, which is where I normally am, I'm sitting on a couch. We actually have the aircon running too, so you can probably hear that because it's very warm here at the moment, and well, hey, why not? So there'll be no animals in the background, no children and things like that, because I'm sitting very pleasantly on a couch on my own, which is kind of nice. I did forget my tripod though, so the footage is going to be a little bit shaky because I'm having to hold my phone. I will get something while I'm out shopping, but I haven't left for the day yet. It's still only 7 o'clock in the morning. So I just want to get this intro done, and then I might sit in a cafe and put the voiceover with the footage to get up, because I have all the voiceover done, but I haven't had a chance to put it all together, and I hadn't done an intro yet. So for anyone who's new here, what we eat in a week, we shop every 6 weeks, though there is a couple of 4-week shops in this period because of Christmas. And we are pretty much a single ingredient household. What we aim to do is buy lots of single ingredients so that we can make most things that we want from those single ingredients without having to have too much storage of separate items. It is much easier to have a barrel of flour than it is to store 20 loaves of bread, for example. But we also, because we go every 6 weeks, a lot of things would have to be frozen to last that long, and we don't have the freezer capacity either. We are looking to upgrade our freezer. We have a small, I think it's a 200-litre chest freezer, and I'd like to buy a 500-litre hybrid fridge freezer. We bought one as a fridge, and I'd like one as a freezer, but they're about $1,000. So it's on the list, but it's not there yet. So we have limited freezer space, and being able to just put things like single ingredients into things is how I like it. So I try not to buy too many pre-made sauces and things like that, because I can make different sauces with the stuff that I already have, and that sort of thing. So we do buy some convenience items. I buy puff pastry, I buy tortillas and things like that. We make them as well, but it's nice to have some in the freezer. So we are a homeschooling family, so we are home for all meals. I only leave the property for medical appointments or every 6 weeks. Darryl goes into town twice a week-ish, 3 times a week, twice during the week, and he goes to church on Sundays. Some of the kids go with him for each trip, and he sometimes buys things in town that we might need, though we definitely try to limit it, because the whole point of doing the 6-weekly grocery shop is we have a budget for the 6 weeks and we make it work, and that's how we save money. So he will sometimes buy some fresh milk, or I think in this video he buys some lettuce and tomato for hamburgers. So generally speaking, we make our food from what we get, and that means there's a lot of from scratch cooking with what we have. So this is a week of meals. I'm not going to go into it anymore because I'm talking sort of, I think because I'm on my grocery shop, I'm giving a bit of the grocery spiel with what we eat in a week of meals. So homeschooling, family of 8, we don't leave the property. Every meal is eaten on the property. I don't show breakfasts, generally speaking, because most of the time it's a bit of a serve yourself affair. There is leftovers to be eaten. There is cereal, rice milk. Sometimes I make almond milk. I will make porridge. Sometimes I make yogurt, I make granola, there is bacon, there is eggs, there's leftover bread, things like that. So just about everyone serves themselves for breakfast, and the first meal that I cook is sort of 11 o'clock, which is Darryl and my breakfast, or the kids' lunch sort of a meal. So it's mainly only lunches and dinners that I show, no breakfasts. And yeah, that's about it. The kids at the moment are 8, 9, 9, 10, 12, and 16. So that's how old the kids are at the moment. And they're all bottomless pits, because that's what children are best at. So that is, I think, the info that you need for it. And we don't do dairy very much. There is children who are intolerant to cow's milk protein, and my husband is lactose intolerant. So we just limit dairy. It's possible that some of them have grown out of it, but we find it easier just to continue along, because the consequences of eating dairy when you're allergic to it, if you are still allergic to it, it can be quite horrible, and I don't want to deal with it. Basically, when they're old enough to test their own limits, they can do it then. They do tolerate fermented dairy now, though, so we do make milk kefir and yogurt from cow's milk, which has opened up a lot of avenues. When the allergist told me I could try them on that, that was fantastic, because making coconut milk yogurt is expensive. So anyway, without any more rambling and squirreling from me. This is a week of meals on our off-grid property for the 8 of us. Alrighty, so day one, we started off the morning having to divide the pizza dough that I had proofed the night before. So I make pizza dough, sourdough pizza dough, and I make it the night before and then it proofs overnight. And then the next morning I divide it. So I pull it out of the bowl and I divide it into approximately 250 gram balls, and I do 8 divisions so that everyone can have their own pizza with their own choice of toppings. Most of the time they don't eat a whole pizza for dinner, but they can then wrap up their own leftovers and have them for lunch the next day or breakfast, so that works quite well. I get asked a lot about schooling the kids and how I have the time to do what I do, and I just wanted to point out that while I'm doing this in the kitchen, the kids come and go asking questions and asking me to check things or write things or spell things or, you know, help them to look other stuff up. So Sonnet's in the corner of the video here because she was asking me something, I'm not sure what, but something that she needed to write down on a piece of paper, how to spell or whatever. I think it may have been how to spell origami, because I think she was looking up origami videos on Epic Reading to do some origami. So throughout, as much as it's not always seen on video, the kids come and go through the kitchen all day. So I just thought I'd mention that because I saw it on the video. Once the dough is divided into 8, it gets put into containers and covered and put in the fridge for the day to use for dinner later on. I find that this gives us the best results. It's still a little bit of a juggle in summer to make sure that it doesn't overproof overnight, but it seems to work quite well. For breakfast, we had the favourite and the constantly, requested and made here because it's something we eat all the time, okonomiyaki. I do have a video, I believe, on how to make this one as well. We're lucky that cabbages last so well. It gives us something crispy and fresh to eat even at the end of the month. In winter they last even just in a box on the bench, and in summer they need to go in the fridge, but they still will last like the full 6 weeks in the fridge. We just make the room for them in the fridge because they're such a versatile thing to have. So they take up a fair bit of room, but they're worth it to have that fresh, crunchy, crispy vegetable at the end of the month that we can use cooked or raw or however we want, especially when we don't have anything coming in from the garden. As I said, I've got a video on making the okonomiyaki, but I generally make them the same way. I shred the cabbage up nice and finely. Sometimes I shred other things like carrot and things like that in it. I put a couple of cups of flour over the cabbage and coat it all. I find this helps the batter to be evenly distributed. And then I add up to a dozen eggs, depending on how many I need to use up, a drizzle of soy sauce and some water, and mix it through. I really do find hands the best job for this. You want each strand of cabbage coated in batter, and I always struggle to do that with a spoon. But I suppose if you were doing a smaller batch, it might be easier, but I always make these giant bowls, so I find my hands the better option. I will add more flour or water as needed to get the consistency right, which is a personal preference. Some people like batter with some cabbage, some like cabbage with some batter. I prefer to err on the side of cabbage with batter. I like the cabbage to be the focus and not the batter. I cook it off in cast iron. I like it at a high heat and a well-oiled pan because I really like the outside to be nice and crispy. Again, that's totally personal preference though. I do like to put them on a rack as they come off the pan so that they don't get too soggy, but it's really not that much of an issue because they're going to go on a plate and have sauce on them and stuff anyway. But picking at those bits of crunchy bits of cabbage while I'm standing there is, the privilege of the cook, and if they're on a rack then they stay nice and crunchy. We like to serve them with some meat of some kind, but you don't have to. Leftover roasts, chicken thighs, sometimes mince, it's whatever we have, and it's a very good meal for just a small portion of meat to be used if there's just a little bit of meat left in the fridge that needs using. I use homemade mayo, and I've been making our own version of ketchup mayonnaise as well, which is basically some brown sugar and soy sauce cooked on the stove until it thickens. It's been really nice to be able to make my own and just knock one other thing off the list of items that I need to purchase. Some kids like mayo, some don't, and I like to make them this smaller size so that I can serve them out one at a time and they can come back for more if they want. For dinner that night, we had the pizzas that I had divided the dough for and put in the fridge. Super simple. I roll them out on some semolina on our board that fits inside the pizza box. I used to have a pizza peel, but it broke, so I need to get a new one. We use a Bakerstone pizza box over the gas barbecue, and there is a review on here of it, but I have changed. I do really like it, and my initial review was that I didn't like it so much, so I probably need to do something again on that. We just bought it from Bunnings. It was like $80, super cheap. Stretch the base out. I've got pizza sauce I canned to use on the base, and each child can pick and choose within the ingredients I have. So we have leftover, any sort of leftover meat that is there, or I will defrost some or cook some to use. We have salami, generally speaking. There is marinated mushrooms, there's anchovies, corn, bacon, there's pineapple that I've canned. Sometimes we have shredded zucchini, sometimes we have thinly sliced potato. It really just depends on what I've got available and what leftovers there are to use on top. Sometimes I make a dairy-free cheese and sometimes I don't, but we generally serve it with dollops of homemade mayo on top, which is very similar to a cheesy texture added onto the pizza. Hollandaise on top is really nice too if I've got a surplus of eggs. If I make some hollandaise and drizzle that over the top of the pizza, that works really well as an alternative for cheese too. Day 2. I made some same-day discard burger buns because I forgot to start them the night before, basically. So I threw everything in the KitchenAid to knead while I got moving on lunch. They're a brioche-style dough, so they always take quite a while to knead because there's some fat in there. And I regularly get impatient if I'm standing there waiting, so I find it a good idea to find something else to do. So these have sourdough starter in them, but they also have a bit of yeast just to boost it to the same day proofing. In our temperatures at the moment, I can sometimes even get away with just using starter even on a same day, but for burger buns that have 2 risers, adding that little bit of yeast there just makes sure that they're nice and fluffy. So while that was kneading, I pulled the smoked pork roast out of the fridge and sliced up a portion of it into chunks to use in a frittata. So this smoked pork was from yesterday, but I don't think... No, it must have been the day before because I don't have it on the video from yesterday. A chunk of that pork sliced up to use in frittata. It's a great way to use up a bunch of eggs and also any kind of leftover meat or veg that you have in the fridge that needs using. So I'm using my cast iron dishes for this so that I can bake them in the barbecue. I split the pork evenly between the 2 pans. I also cut up some baby beet leaves and some silver beet that I had fetched from the garden to go in there, as well as... I sometimes saute this off first, but with this small amount of greens, it's not that big a deal. If I've got great big handfuls of greens, I saute them because you want them to shrink down a little bit to put in the frittata, but I didn't have a huge amount because there's just not a huge amount in the garden just yet. So I just put them in green. I added some caramelized onion jam to both. I could have cooked up some caramelized onions, but I was being a bit lazy, so I just used a jar of my pre-caramelized onion jam. And I split a tin of corn between both dishes as well. I mixed up a cup of coconut cream with 12 eggs and a bit of salt and pepper and garlic. And I used the Thermomix to do it because I like to incorporate lots of air into this egg mix. I pour it over the pork and greens mix and then sprinkle some cut up cherry tomatoes over the top too. When we have the really fresh, gorgeous beefsteak tomatoes from the garden, I put nice big slices of tomato on top of these, and that's really, really nice. But the cherry tomatoes work too. I repeated the process, mixed 1 cup of coconut milk, 12 eggs, salt and garlic and pepper, poured it over and topped with tomato pieces as well. Then popped them both in the barbecue to bake. By this point the dough was done, so I scraped it into a bowl to proof. I think I had the intention to bake something else with the KitchenAid, which is why I put it in a different bowl, but I'm not sure and I didn't, so who knows. So I put it into a different container to proof. About an hour later, it was because it was being very warm here, and there was the instant yeast in it. The dough had domed nicely and sort of doubled. It's always hard to tell when using round bowls like this, but it looked pretty good to me. If you want to have a clear view of when a dough had doubled, you need to use a straight-sided container. I divided it into about 90-gram portions, as that's the size I like, and put it in the trays. I do 8 to a tray so that they have plenty of space to spread out as well as up, because we want them as burger buns, not like slider buns, these ones, so we want them to be able to go out as well as up. And then put them aside to do their second proof. This is what the frittata looked like when it was done. It's lovely and fluffy with that added coconut cream and incorporating the air with the Thermomix. I made a fresh batch of duck egg mayo because we love a drizzle of mayo over the frittata as well, and so that's how we ate it. There was some leftovers that went in the fridge, I believe, of these 2 frittatas that were made up for lunch. Once the buns had done their second proof, I egg washed them and sprinkled with some sesame seeds and popped them in the oven. This is what they looked like baked. I put them on a rack and put put aside with a cover over them to cool. When we had picked the cucumbers the day before, I think it was, I had said I would make some quick pickles for them to have on their hamburgers. So I mixed up a super simple brine of apple cider vinegar, some salt, garlic, mustard seeds and a bit of sugar, heated it up to a simmer on the stove to dissolve the sugar, sliced the cucumbers up, and as you can see, these are a little bit bigger than pickling size cucumbers should get, which is why they've got that open cavity in the middle. But I think if I want to grow enough that I have enough to make pickling worthwhile, I'd need quite a few more vines at a time. Something to think about next year when it's cooler again, because cucumbers actually don't normally like the heat. So I feel like the plants are doing awfully well considering the heat at the moment. But I'll have a think about the fact that I might want to grow double the amount that what I'm growing, since we're doing so well. I filled a jar with them and then poured the hot brine over the top, put a lid on it, shook it and rotated the jar to distribute the mustard seeds around, and then let it cool for a bit and then into the fridge. For the hamburger patties, I had to mince up some beef. So I opened up a bag of the beef trim that I had purchased from Costco. So I buy their beef trim by the box, which is what they turn into their mince, and I choose to turn it into mince myself because it comes vacuum sealed that way, so I can make it into mince whenever I want throughout the 6-week period. I cut a bunch of chunks out to use for something else, so any of the nice meaty chunks with a little bit of fat on them I use for other things, and then I mince the rest up for making hamburger patties. I just do a single grind on my mincer. I prefer it slightly chunky than too fine and mushed up. I use a Louvel grinder and I absolutely adore it, and I do have an affiliate code if someone is interested. But I upgraded to this from the grinder on the KitchenAid, and it has just made life so much easier. It is so easy to use, so quick, and I really, really enjoy it. Once I had it all sorted, I weighed out about 2 kilos of mince to use for the burgers, and there ended up just being just over it, I think. So there'll be a bit of extra, but we'll just make extra for tomorrow or whatever. I only add salt and onion powder to my mince for the patties. I bring it all together with my hands. I want to knead it a little bit to emulsify the meat a bit so it will hold together better as a patty. I like to use my tortilla press as a kind of smash burger-esque type feel. One day I might get one of those cast iron presses so that I can press them when they're in the pan, but for the moment I've got the cast iron tortilla press and that works. I press them fairly thin because they shrink back up in the pan, but they have that wonderful meaty texture. They're not smushy at all. They're nice and textured. I fry them off in a hot pan to get good caramelization, and for mine I put a bit of cheese on them when they're in the pan to melt. I have this sliced cheese that Darryl got me from the hamper pantry, which I've kept in the freezer and have been using. It'll last me months. We had some sliced tomatoes, some of the pickles, mayo and caramelized onion, jam and lettuce on there. Darryl had bought the lettuce and a couple of tomatoes from town because he happened to be going in today and we were having burgers for dinner, and it's always nice to have tomato and lettuce on your burgers. If we don't have it, we don't have it, but it's nice if the trip into town happens to coincide with a meal like that, and then we will pick up a couple of things from town to just make it that little bit better. Day 3. The next morning, I didn't film it, but we had leftover meat patties cooked up and served inside the leftover lettuce as like an old style lettuce burger. We used to eat these a lot when we were doing keto and things like that many years ago. I didn't take any footage, but I did get a quick pic when I took it back to my desk to keep working. So this is what they looked like, just basically the same burger as last night but wrapped in lettuce instead of hamburger buns because there wasn't any buns left. For dinner that night we had nachos. So I used the chicken mince that I had minced up in the food prep video. I cooked it off with some spices and salt in the pan. I cooked up a cheese sauce of sorts in the Thermomix. It uses some tapioca and some natural yeast, nutritional yeast, as well as some spices and stuff. And it cooks up into a stringy cheese sauce. It actually worked really well. It was very stringy, a mozzarella style texture to it. On day 4, we did sourdough tortillas for lunch this day. I do a fairly simple tortilla recipe with some lard and starter in it and flour. Pinch it all off into 50-gram balls, and then I dip each ball into flour and roll them out. Now, I'm not picky about round tortillas. It just doesn't worry me too much. I could, if I put the effort in, roll them round, but yeah, it's not necessary. Also, because I have discovered, because I'm rolling it on a stainless steel bench, the bench bows at certain points, which means the rolling pin has different pressure at different points of the bench. So it's all just too complicated. So I just go for thin. I like to be able to see the markings on the mat underneath the dough well. So I want the dough to be thin enough to be see-through to see the dough mat markings through it. I cook them off in a dry cast iron pan, and I keep them in a container covered with a tea towel so that they steam and stay really flexible. I had scrambled a bunch of eggs. I mixed through the leftover chicken mince to warm up with it, and we used some mayo, apple butter barbecue, and I had a bit of cheese with mine too. The scrambled egg and chicken mince mix, and we rolled them up as sort of a breakfast burrito for lunch that day. For dinner that night, we had ramen. So I cooked off half a cabbage in the pan till it wilted a bit, and then I added a bag of the pulled pork that I had made earlier in the month. It would have been in one of the food prep videos earlier in the month. And I'd frozen it in vacuum seal bags. I put it in the pan and put a lid on it until it finished defrosting. The middle of it was still frozen, and that's fine. It's just going to cook through, defrost and heat through with the cabbage in that pan. If the cabbage is kind of soft, it doesn't matter. We're eating it with ramen, so that's fine. So I just put the pulled pork in with the cabbage and put the lid on it so it all defrost and cook through. The sauce for the ramen, I do a version of that viral TikTok that went around a while ago. So they use standard 2-minute noodle packs and stuff, but I do something similar. I put a bunch of egg yolks in the bowl. I add a really good serving of homemade duck egg mayo. It has cowboy candy in the mayo as well, so it's a very tasty mayo. I put a couple of tablespoons of Vegeta in it, and I whisk it all together. I use the Jinmailing ramen noodles we like. They're only $3.10 per kilo at Coles, so they're a great price and a great texture. And then added them to the sauce. Again, a bit like my pesto pasta, you're going to temper the eggs with the noodles. So you just put a chunk of noodles in there, mix it through, and then a bit more. If you put too much in there too quickly, you're going to scramble the eggs. So a tongue full of ramen, mix, and then add more and mix. And then you see that the egg yolks cook and the sauce becomes lovely and creamy. Add water from the noodles as well to keep it all nice and loose and not too gluggy. The longer it sits, sometimes the gluggier it gets, which can be unpleasant. So adding the noodle water to loosen it up helps. Mix through the cooked cabbage and the pulled pork and served. So it's a very simple meal, but it's super tasty, and you can use so many different things that you want, and it can have any kind of a meat, any kind of vegetables, and the kids have been known to basically make it with nothing but the noodles for lunch sometimes, so We actually had dessert that night as well. I've been experimenting with the ice cream maker that I bought last shopping trip, and I've made this really, really nice chocolate ice cream a few times now. It's dairy free, so it's made with coconut cream, but it just tastes chocolatey. You can barely even tell that it's not on dairy. Darryl bought some cheap cones from town for us to use. I've ordered a cast iron stovetop, like a pizza waffle cone type maker, so I am going to try making my own. But for the moment, he bought some cheap cones from town. The cheap cones are great to have on hand, and eating it in the cones just means the portion control is better. You only need a big scoop on top of a cone and you feel like you've well and truly had enough, unlike when you put it into a bowl. Once all that was done and eaten and packed away, I mixed up some bagel dough for bagels for tomorrow morning. I mixed a double batch up and put them in the bowl with a cover to proof overnight on the bench. Fed my starters while I was kneading, and then closed up the kitchen for the night. Day 5. I got up nice and early so that the dough didn't overproof. That's one of the big key things in summer here, is that if I don't get up and moving fairly quickly, it heats up too quickly and things overproof. So I break my dough up into approximately 90 gram portions. It's quite a stiff dough, the bagel dough, so it's fairly easy to work with. I do believe I have a video on how to make bagels here as well that goes into detail more. Once it's all portioned out, I roll each portion into a tight ball, much like if I was making bread rolls. You want a nice tight skin on the top of the roll. Once all the balls are formed, I start with the first ones I formed as they've had time to rest now, and I put a hole in them. There's a lot of ways to put the holes in bagels. Some people roll them out into sausages and join. There's lots of different preferences, but this is the way that I do mine, and I find it really simple. I put my thumb through from the top and then just gently stretch it out to make the hole wider. After that, I put a pot of water on to boil, drizzle in a little honey, and then boil the bagels for 30 seconds each side. I accidentally put them directly on the rack instead of on silicone on the rack, so we have pretty rack-shaped lines in the bottoms of this batch. Once they've cooled briefly to be handleable, I dip them in my version of everything but the bagel seasoning, a mix of onion and garlic flakes, sesame seeds, flaked salt, and poppy seeds, and put them back on the rack to bake. I bake them for about 25 minutes in the hooded barbecue, until they get good colour, and it's about 25. timings in a hooded barbecue are kind of hard to judge. It depends on the ambient temperature and everything else, because they don't have any insulation built into those hooded barbecues. So if it's hot outside, it runs hotter. If it's cold outside, it runs colder. After they had cooled a bit, Darryl cooked up the insides for me and brought it to me at my desk. So we had bacon, eggs, caramelized onion jam, and some mayo. For dinner that night, we had some of the Kievs. I took that opportunity to bake up some to freeze for future meals and to bake some for tonight. I put them in a cast iron baking tray. I lined it with baking paper to catch all the juices so that we could pour out that over our mash and stuff. Someone suggested in the comments to put bread underneath them, and then you have like garlic toast as well as the Kievs. That'll be interesting. I'll have to try and time it so that I actually have some bread to use at the same time and give that a go. I used a probe to check the temperature of the chicken mince, but they take about 45 to 50 minutes at the 120 gram size from frozen at about 180. I'd picked some zucchini in the garden that morning, so we used some of that with dinner. I just sliced it into slices. I put it in a cast iron pan with some butter and garlic. I used nutlegs, I think. I would use nutlegs or ghee, and sauteed it all up. One of the ways we really like zucchini is done like this. It's super simple, but it's just so tasty. I also mashed some potato and steamed some mixed veg as well to have with it too. So we had mashed potato, the zucchini, steamed veg, and the Kievs on these plates. It was a very, very yummy meal. Day 6. There were leftover bagels, but we'd run out of bacon. I had the beef chunks out to start on pie filling for dinner, so I sliced some really thin and fried them off for us all to have on the leftover bagels. We had the normal fried eggs, mayo, caramelized onion jam, and some of the beef, and it was tasty. The beef is fairly chewy prepared like this, but it is very tasty and worth a little bit of effort. I always struggle with day-old bagels and chewy steak because of my face, but I just take it slow and cut things up when needed. And I can always make myself something else in this instance. If the kids and Darryl want something like that, I can always make something else. After we had eaten, I got started on the pie filling. So I went super simple. I caramelized off some onions, seasoned the beef with some salt and pepper and flour, cooked that off in batches in hot oil to get some color on it. Once that was all cooked, I deglazed the pan with a bit of balsamic vinegar and chicken stock. Added the onions back in, as well as a big bag of shredded squash that I had. So these were the patty pan squash that we had extra of from the last hamper. We didn't get to eat them all before I went on my grocery run, so while I was gone, I got the kids to grate them all up and put them in the freezer. I personally wouldn't have put the whole lot in one bag, but they did. So I just used that whole big bag in the pie mix. I also had a couple of frozen bags of mushrooms too that I stuck in there as well. Mushroom, once you freeze it, the texture isn't great, but in something like pie filling, it's going to add a whole bunch of flavour and the texture really doesn't matter. I added some of my homemade Worcestershire sauce. This is the plum-based one by Sally Wise, and I highly recommend it. Some tomato paste in there as well. Salt and pepper is needed, and I let it simmer for a few hours until the meat started to get nice and tender. Once the beef was almost fall apart, I added a good shake of the Maggi rich gravy powder that we love, even though it's not great for us, but you know, it's super tasty, to thicken it up. I had been simmering it with the lid on, so it hadn't reduced much on its own, but I wasn't supervising it, so I wasn't comfortable leaving the lid off because it would have cooked down too quickly. We would have risked burning. We kind of need a burner that's a little bit less powerful. Once that had thickened up, I turned it off and put it aside to cool. Now, because pies are much better constructed when the pie filling is chilled, I actually put this aside for the next day's dinner. For dinner, Darryl had requested pesto pasta, but with the KFC style chicken that I make. So I made some sourdough pasta up. I used my standard recipe, 100 grams of starter, 400 grams of flour, 3 eggs, and 60 grams of oil with a pinch of salt. I bring it to ball stage using the Thermomix, and then I tip it out onto the dough mat and make it a little more cohesive before putting it aside to rest for a couple of hours. While that was resting, I got started on tomorrow's bread, deciding to make a couple of focaccias. I'm still working on my timing here with the weather changes, and I think I started this too early in the afternoon or not early enough. If I had done all the bulking earlier, I probably could have put it in the fridge overnight, but as I said, the weather change in bread, it's all a work in progress every season. So I mixed up 2 bowls of dough for these for tomorrow, put them aside to stretch and fold and coil fold throughout the late afternoon and evening. I then rolled out the sourdough pasta. I have a generic KitchenAid pasta attachment that I use. It works really well. The only thing I dislike about it is that it doesn't pull apart for cleaning. So I tend to use a chunk of dough, a bit like you would use blue tack, to clean something and run it through all parts of the rollers on all different thicknesses to pick up any dust and debris that might have fallen in there. I should really remove it and put it in a container after every use, but I have to get Darryl to undo it for me. I can't get it undone, so I forget. I rolled it out and nobody could find my pastry cutter, so I had to cut it with my dough scraper. It was a bit more long-winded than usual, but we got there in the end. The Temu pasta rack was a fail too. It has broken many arms off and it's too short, and this was one Temu purchase that I'm not overly happy with. I'm happy with a fair few of them, this one not one of them. Once that was done, I put it aside to set a bit of a skin on the surface. I find that helps it to not stick together as badly in the pan, but also if I was to be freezing it, it helps it not to freeze to each other in the bags. And I got started on the chicken. I pulled a pack of filleted chicken breasts out of the freezer and defrosted them. I do a seasoned flour mix, garlic, onion, smoked paprika, salt, pepper, thyme, etc. A bit of a KFC-esque flavour mix. I dip the chicken in the flour and then the egg and then back in the flour, and it gives it a really nice layer of breading that kind of puffs away from the chicken, but the chicken is still nice and moist. We cook it off in just a little bit of lard or ghee mixed with oil. This makes for a really good crumb, I found, in the cast iron, placing it on a rack afterwards. The kids had standard spaghetti pesto pasta. Whilst they do like the sourdough pasta, they like dried pasta as well, and the shapes it comes in, and it's a lot more convenient when I can cook up 1 kilo of dried pasta for them than trying to make that much handmade, and it gives them leftovers for the next day most of the time too, so they don't mind either way, and it makes it easier on me. I prefer the sourdough pasta though. So the pesto pasta recipe is on a short here somewhere, but it's 3 egg yolks, a jar of pesto, which is 190 grams, a drizzle of olive oil, a drizzle of cowboy candy, and a drizzle of lemon juice, salt and pepper. You whisk it all up. Then you add the hot pasta with some pasta water in a little at a time and mix it as you add it. Cooks the eggs into a creamy sauce as you go. Same as the ramen, don't be tempted to put too much in initially because you are tempering your eggs, and if you put too much in too fast, the eggs will scramble. And it's still totally edible, but it's not that creamy sauce that you're going for. If it's too gluggy, add some of the pasta water in there to loosen it up as well. We served it with the fresh KFC chicken, which we had plenty of leftovers of the pasta and the chicken. It's really nice with some parmesan in the mix too, if you're making that pesto sauce. And when Darryl used to eat dairy, we would have added parmesan as well, but we're also used to it now that it really doesn't make much difference. And day 7, we had leftover KFC chicken from the night before and the focaccias that I had baked first thing in the morning. Now, they were overproofed, as I had worried they would be, and nowhere near as puffy as I like my focaccia to be, but still very edible. All I did was cut off some small sandwich-sized pieces, toast them off and fill them. I warmed up the chicken. I'm just showing one here because I make a big platter for the kids. I cut it all up. I cut the bread into sandwich pieces. I heat up the chicken and put it all on the tray, and then add whatever they can choose from to eat their sandwiches. I think some of the boys even just had peanut butter on theirs, actually, so, whatever they wanted on it. But I had some cheese, mayo, caramelized onion jam, and the chicken. Super simple, but very tasty. For dinner, we had the pies. So I had to make some pastry up first, earlier in the day. I do a dairy-free lard and olive oil pastry. It's 400 grams of flour, 110 grams of ice water, 60 grams of lard, and 60 grams of olive oil with a pinch of salt. This makes the top and bottom of a family-sized deep pie. I actually wanted to make 2 pies, and so I attempted to double the recipe, but I wasn't sure if the Thermomix could tolerate it. It turns out it was a little bit much for it. So I had put it all in, but I had to pull it back out and split it up and mix it. So I should have just done 2 single batches, one after the other, like I normally do, but I was being impatient. Lesson learned. So once I got it figured out, I separated the dough into 4 circles, being the top and bottom of 2 pies, and put it in the fridge to chill until closer to dinner time. Later that afternoon, I pulled it out of the fridge. I rolled it out on a floured dough mat. Rolling pie crust is not something I've done a huge amount of, and it's not something I would say I'm particularly good at, but I manage. I have 2 cast iron pans that I tend to use, this nice deep red one and one of the blue ones that Mum bought me for my birthday. Both seem to work well for the purpose. So I line the base with pastry, put the chilled pie mix in, making sure to mound it slightly in the middle so that the top pastry doesn't sink but looks nice and full. I roll out the top pastry piece and place it on. I very simply trim the crust and knuckle pinch the edges into some maybe semblance of a fluting, and then put a slit in the top of the pie for steam to escape, and then repeat the process.
I cooked them in the hooded barbecue until the internal temp was about 60. The filling is obviously pre-cooked, so I'm just getting it nice and hot and the crust cooked. We always have the dilemma that if you let a pie sit and set, it comes out in these really nice slices. But by the time it's cooked, everyone just wants to eat, so the servings end up looking like train smashers. But hey, they taste good. I also had gone out into the garden while the pies were cooking, and nobody had put any veggies or potato or anything on it, so we just ate pie. And hey, there was a couple of kilo of veggie in with the steak mix, so, but it would have been nicer with mashed potato and veggies as well. That's how I tend to like to eat the pie.
So that was another week of meals in our household. Now, there's a couple of things referred to in there for meal prep videos. So after I do my groceries, I tend to do meal prep videos every couple of days that goes through how I preserve, use, and freeze and pre-prep food that we've purchased in that 6-week grocery haul. So if you're interested in checking those out, then they're a couple of videos back. So every time I do the groceries, I share the grocery haul, but then I share videos for every couple of days after that, showing how I'm using the stuff that I got from the groceries, because that was one of the biggest questions that people asked. So some of the stuff referred to in the meals is stuff that I've shown in those prep videos. My what we eat in a week videos tend to get quite long anyway. I find it hard to condense down what we're doing when there's so many things to share about the meals and stuff. So we don't need to add any more into that. So I hope you enjoyed watching that, and it gave some inspiration and things to add to your menu or to adjust in your menu and things like that. And I will see you on the next video. Thanks, guys.